Harvey's confession gives Parker a sense of crisis, and the two of them look at each other and begin a contest with their eyes. Parker's domineering statement that it doesn't need Harvey to like his wife. Harvey ignored him as well and turned to me and gently told me that if I wanted herbs in the future, I should ask him for them. Said there was no need to pay me for food. Parker immediately disguised himself as a little mute panther and told me, I know the flavor of all those herbs. I'll pick them up for you on the mountain later. And I wonder how talking about it was conclusive that I couldn't have children. Is it because I'm not in heat? Suddenly, Parker caught a strange whiff, then leaned over and looked up at me, asking why I suddenly smelled so good. I had a familiar feeling, a lurch in my belly, and then a rush to pull Parker about to go home. Parker wondered why I was in such a hurry. I suddenly opened my eyes wide. No good, it was too late. I saw a splash of bright red blood down my thigh, and I reached out to cover it too late. Suddenly, one of the orc males said, Look, she's in heat. Eudora on the sidelines was full of shock. I sat her down on my knees in embarrassment, and the crowd of orcs around me exploded. In heat. Really in heat. This made Parker so happy. It felt like he was going to be a father. As soon as it picked me up, repeating 2 times and 3 times, my female's in heat. Only to see Parker start up his little motor, giggle, and run home with a ha 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 laugh, leaving the leopard crowd with a head full of embarrassment. There was a panther woman on the side comforting an exasperated and trembling Eudora, and advising him to be kind to me. Eudora suddenly raised a clenched fist. What do you know? Spilling the flowers of the woman who had just been scared. On the other hand, my crisis was just about to arrive, as Parker said that when my great aunt was gone, I would be ready to have my cubs. My mouth dropped open in surprise when I heard Parker's words, and then I started to convince Parker to let himself go. I tried to dissuade Parker by saying that I was underage, but Parker said that being in heat was adulthood. I thought to myself, aggressively, that I had been on my period since I was 13 years old, and this place wasn't going to let 13-year-old females have babies, was it? From Parker, I learned that in this world, women start their period at the age of 15 or 16, once a year for 5 days. I am so envious of the once-a-year physiological period. Puck was suddenly curious. Kay was an adult. Hadn't the clan taught him? I had a moment of weakness, then asked Parker what to do. We can't just bleed out. Come we. Parker rushed his arse off to stumping white cotton for me, then heartily danced around begging for praise. I was also so speechless and helpless that I had to reach out and pet the cheetah's head and praise him for being good. A happy Parker went off hunting for me again, with a bounce and gentle instructions to rest and stay put. I looked at Parker, who was excited as a child, and said that my heart was tired and I was glad that I had solved the problem of the auntie's napkin. The smoke rose from the thatch hut, and I handled the cotton towel, feeling much more comfortable, smelling the scent that came to my nose. I looked for it. I just saw a pile of roasted meat on the table, and it was too much. Parker explained that because I was physiological, they were all going to have to make up for it. I'm full of doubts. I'm bleeding to make up for it. What do you mean you're making up for it? Parker stepped forward with a bad smile on his face. Of course it's to have a baby with you. I was speechless. Is this leopard brain wattage? Open your mouth and shut it to have a baby. I plucked up the courage to take a stand. I don't want to be close to you. Why don't you just send me back to the woods? Parker, with disappointment in his eyes, asked if I disliked him that much. Looking at poor Parker, I again hastened to explain that I was grateful and quite fond of him, and that, but it's not there yet, and if Parker gets tough, I'll have no choice but to leave. Parker heard that I was leaving and reminded me that there were more than just beasts in the forest. There were also stray beasts that would be locked up if I met them. And then Parker scared me that if I fell into the hands of a stray, I'd just be forced to keep having babies. Parker thought to himself, she doesn't even know about stray beasts. She really is a little hothouse flower. Parker started to give me the scoop on stray beasts, which are cold-blooded beasts like snake beasts and lizard beasts. Listening to Parker, my whole body was bad. This orc world is actually so scary. I shook my head frantically to show that I wasn't leaving. Definitely not. Seeing this, Puck happily extends his evil claws. So let's go deeper. I was so scared that I dodged it, and when I couldn't avoid it, I reached out and pushed and asked Parker what the hurry was. Parker explains that the chances of a female getting pregnant are too low to pass up on a once-a-year opportunity. I waved my hands in horror and said, no, I'll be here once a month. I'll have plenty of chances in the future. Parker said gravely that this was impossible, having seen various tribes himself, all once a year, and you apes are the same. I really had a hard time with this, I'm a human being myself, so understands the pain of having a period every month. All I could do was shift tactics and blink my big bling eyes and pout. Parker, should we still cultivate our relationship before we think about it? Where had Parker ever seen anything like this before? And his expression was truly sheepish and resigned. Suddenly the duo smelled a smell, and Parker turned his head to see that the meat was mushy. Parker rushes to remedy the situation. I watched from the sidelines as Parker made up his mind to come clean about being purely human if he couldn't be convinced by the end of his physiological period. The next day, I came out to the tribe to hang out alone to avoid Puck, who was full of raw kids. I looked up and saw Eve, the female orc I had met yesterday, and I called out to Eve from behind to nag her. Eve sniffed and turned back, and when she saw me, she asked me where I was going. I just said I was taking a break from my meal, and my attention was drawn to the 3 baby leopards in the bamboo basket. So cute. Are these your cats? Eve breathlessly explains that this is the leopard cub she had. I apologized awkwardly. Sorry. Eve didn't mind, and congratulated me on my fast approaching rut, and soon I'll be able to have pups with Parker. Eve said, crouching down and releasing the leopard cub. Listening to Eve, I said with a sad face that I didn't want to be close to Parker. With a questioning look on her face, Eve asked me if I hated Parker. I sat her down feebly and looked at the plain panther and said, nor did I. I was grateful to him for saving me, but it was developing too fast for me to accept. Eve rested her chin on one hand and tried to enlighten me that it was a woman's vocation to bear children, and we orcs are so few in number. We're all that's left to sustain us. If you don't hate him, it's only right that you get in touch with him and have more pups. I really couldn't agree with that, and I got emotional and said, no, I don't want to have a baby that early. My strong reaction also stunned Eve, who just stared at me in disbelief. Not knowing what to say, I hastened to explain that I was thinking of having a relationship regeneration. Then Eve suggested I tell Parker about the idea. I've tried this approach and it doesn't really work. Then Eve thought for a moment and gave a new suggestion. Then you threaten him? I asked in disbelief. You mean threaten her? I'm not threatening anything. Eve explained to me that it's absolutely fine to dissolve the partnership if you say she dares to mess around. It turns out that in this world, as long as a woman doesn't like a man, it's possible to break off a partnership with them. It's just that the jilted man can never have a mate again, not even to get back together. After I understood the reason, I actually felt a little sympathy for the man here. I looked down into deep thought. What the hell was I going to do with Parker? At this point, Parker was still at home, worried about why I hadn't come back after being out for so long. Parker's eyes instantly lit up at the sound of my return. Only Parker rushed out to greet me and sweetly reminded me of the new cotton. The next thing I knew, my words hit Parker like a bolt from the blue. Thanks, Parker, but I've decided not to get close to you for a while. Parker said excitedly. You don't mean what you say, and besides you don't have another man. Who else but me? I stated that I wouldn't get close to anyone, but if Parker dared to mess around, I would break off my partnership with him after that. Parker was furious and had no choice but to commiserate about how he had fallen for such a heartless woman. I can only reassure Parker that he can have a baby anytime he wants to. Parker expressed his disbelief, and I condescendingly dropped a love it or leave it comment before striding away. And so the days went by. I was getting burned out on meat every day and was ready to find some wild greens for my vitamins. I managed to find a prickly stage plant, and just as I was enjoying the natural delicacy, suddenly my feet slipped. My body was out of control, and I fell straight into a big hole. The shock of gravity made my head spin, and it took me a long time to get over it. I started looking around my surroundings, trying to find a way out. I spotted a large rock not far away that I should be able to step on. I walked cautiously in the direction of the boulder, and suddenly found a red cloth. I went closer and touched it. The cloth was as soft and smooth as silk and had a scale texture on it. Out of all sorts of curiosity, I decided to take it back and ask Parker about it. With great joy, I showed Parker that the piece of cloth I had picked up today. Parker looked at it with a hint of surprise and fear on his face. Suddenly, Parker knocked the cloth out of my hand, much to my confusion. That's when Parker panicked and grabbed me by the shoulders and asked, "Where did you pick it up?" I said, "At the lake," and Parker fell into deep thought. Curious, I asked Parker what the hell it was. Only Parker looked ahead and said thoughtfully, "Here comes the horde, the wandering beasts." Hearing the words stray beasts, I broke into a cold sweat. Didn't they say that stray beasts don't appear here? I'm very confused. What is this thing? What does cloth have to do with stray beasts? Parker said with a fearful face. This is not cloth. This is a snake beast, an adult snake mold. Parker explained to her that adult snake beasts will use snake mold to please their mates. It seems that this snake beast has good molting skills. What a pity. Turnip touched her chin and wondered what the pity was. Parker smiled smugly and pulled up the corner of his mouth and gave a cold snort. Then Parker gritted his teeth and said, "It's a pity that it didn't fall into my hands. I'll burn it and let him seduce my woman." Turnip hurriedly reached out and pulled his arm, opening his mouth to stop him. "That's someone else's stuff. Better give it back." But Parker didn't listen to her, turned and headed that way, telling the woman she didn't have to return it. "Stray beasts are dangerous, and the intruder, the beasts have to be put to death. I not only want to burn his snake mold, but also to gather the clan beast to hang him." Parker was gritting his teeth and talking about it. Suddenly he realized that there was no answer from behind him for a long time. So he looked back, only to find that Turnip had long since disappeared. He was startled, and then a bit furious, cursing, "What a fool. I told you that stray beasts are dangerous." White Turnip, barefoot, dashed outside and ran out with great strides. The wind whistled past her body. In her heart, she thought anxiously that she had to return it in a hurry. Holding the red snake mold tightly in her arms, she was panting with exhaustion. When she was running fast, suddenly a person appeared in front of her eyes. She stopped with some doubts. "Who is this? How come so handsome?" Bai QingQing carefully surveyed this uninvited guest in front of her, but couldn't help but think his tattoos were even twice as many as Parker's. Moreover, he had long red hair, straight and smooth, knife-like face, deep eyes, simply handsome. Turnip Bai couldn't help but look dumbfounded and frowsy in place, her eyes shining brightly as she stared straight ahead, her face blushing with shame, and she didn't move a muscle. At this time, Parker chased after her and ran towards her, shouting her name anxiously. Turnip heard the voice and turned back to her. When she heard the voice, she looked back and saw Parker's face was ugly. His expression was gloomy, and he shouted anxiously, "Turnip, come over here." And when she saw him, she immediately realized that it was not good, and looked at the red-haired man in front of her with a horrified face, and couldn't help but take a few steps back in fear. In her heart, she had a suspicion that this man might be a stray beast, and as expected, the next second he reached out his hand towards her. Turnip couldn't dodge at all. He grabbed his arm tightly and carried it into his arms. Turnip screamed out in fear. Curtis looked down at the girl in his arms, and quickly realized that she was still holding her snake mold tightly in her arms. Curtis instantly smiled with pleasure, and couldn't help but think, "She likes my snake mold, even though it's not very pretty." He reached out his hand and gently touched Turnip's cheek, sizing her up, winning without any make markings. Is she still underage? Not far away, Parker saw this scene, has long been unable to endure, even dared to touch the turnip, so it transformed back to the body, launched an attack. Just as it swooped out to let go of Turnip, he was swiftly swung by Curtis' tail and knocked down to the ground so hard that it didn't get up for a while. Seeing Parker like this, surely he was hurt. Turnip cried out in worry and couldn't help but reach out for him, but was Curtis tightly embraced in his arms. Could not move, could not break free from his grip. White Turnip twisted his head and shouted at him, "You let go of me!" On the other side of the Parker, it was only then that he staggered to his feet. This time he was really careless. He didn't expect it to be a striped stray beast, so he opened his mouth wide and roared at the sky, seeking help from his clan members. At this time, not far away from the clan, keen to hear this sound, do not know what happened, but they are sure that it is the voice of Parker. So they all face serious. Sidehead, anxious to follow the companion, said, "Must be something happened. Let's go to check it out." Soon gathered a few orcs, everyone together towards the place where the sound came from. Quickly rushed to, waiting for the scene. Down scenes of orcs saw the situation in front of them. They have to talk about it, carefully sizing up the person who came. They found out that this stray beast was a snake beast, and he'd even grabbed Parker's female, and on the side of the Parker's mouth bleeding, trembling, and barely supporting the body. Parker actually injured. Anxiously shouted, "Quickly help him." Just when he wanted to rush out, the leading beastman found something wrong, reached out to stop them. His face darkened. 4 lines. He is a 4 lines beastman. They were shocked. In the entire 10,000 beast city, there are only 5 for tattooed beasts. Even Parker, who is a tattooed beast, can't beat him. If we go up there, it will only make the tribe's casualties worse. The clansmen were worried, and Parker's face became serious. "So it seems that I can only save you myself." So he rushed up again, regardless of life and death. Curtis saw the situation, also quickly reacted, with the snake tail smacked hard to the ground. After that, he raised his tail high and threw Parker into the air. Seeing that Parker actually really didn't want to die in general, White Turnip rushed at him with tears in her eyes and shouted, "Don't you care about me? You run away." When Curtis saw that the little female was in his arms, but she was still thinking about someone else, his expression was instantly gloomy. His body exuded a gloomy aura. His mood became even more unpleasant. His eyes stared harshly at Parker, and Parker didn't budge at this time. Standing majestically in front of them, there was no way he would let him take Turnip right away. His eyes were resolute, and he also looked back fiercely. The atmosphere between the two beasts was instantly tense. Curtis couldn't stand it anymore and took the initiative to attack, fiercely flinging his snake tail, bringing up a cloud of dust, showing how powerful it was. He quickly moved his tail and surrounded Parker in the center, constantly rotating and narrowing the circle, wanting to strangle Parker to death. Curtis continued to tighten his tail, and in a matter of moments, it had shrunk to the point where it was strangling Parker's head. As she looked to be dying, Turnip watched the scene with a pained expression. Tears snatched out of her eyes. She anxiously begged, clinging to her Curtis, constantly slapping his chest. "You quickly let him go. Please let him go." White Turnip mouth constantly said please please. Looked very sad. Curtis looked down at the girl like this, expression pondering. After all, his heart was still soft, and he reached out his hand to take the girl's shoulder, but he didn't drop it. Finally, he seriously opened his mouth and said yes. "I let him go, so promised." He reached out and gently wiped away the tears on the girl's cheeks, looking at the White Turnip crying face red. "I see the poor low had to coax people do not cry," and then gently kissed. The girl cried red eyes. He was a little heartbroken, so loosened the snake tail wrapped around Parker. Parker at this time has long been dizzy up. Curtis was ready to take Turnip right away, but also did not forget to twist his head to threaten him. "Do not want to die. Do not come after him again." Parker from the body changed back to the form of the beastman. He fell despondently, lowered his head, did not say a word, half kneeling on the ground, remembering to gnash his teeth. His face was dark and gloomy, and eventually he didn't hold back his tears. He had nowhere to vent his grief, so he angrily raised his head and shouted White Turnip's name to the sky. And at that moment, Curtis took Turnip with him back to his own land, a cave hidden in a dense forest. Turnip was held in his arms, and was a little puzzled. Was this cave his lair? Curtis gently placed the girl on the ground. Turnip couldn't help but be scared. She kept shrinking back, until she hit the wall behind her and couldn't help but think, is he going to start now? I can't help but cry out in fear. "Don't do it. I'm afraid of snakes. Even if I crash my head to death, I won't lay a snake's egg." But as Curtis stared at the girl, he couldn't help but think, that's a very youthful reaction. Obviously she has never been in contact with a male, which means this female is all mine. Curtis is possessive, so he smiled at the girl and introduced himself. "My name is Curtis. What's yours?" Trying to smile as gently as possible, but Turnip was so scared that she shivered in a corner of the cave, and the atmosphere between the two of them instantly quieted down. Curtis was very considerate to speak, said to himself, "And I call you Bai? You females have to eat every day, right?" But I didn't expect White Turnip to instantly blow up, shouting in anger and rage. "Don't need you to care." I didn't expect Curtis' face to be gloomy. He clenched his fists, sulked, and instantly snaked away. White Turnip him like this, instantly did not dare to speak again. Tightly pursed lips, scared to look at him. Curtis stared at the girl in silence for a while. The two did not break the awkward atmosphere for a while. In the end, Curtis still gave in to his softness, although his voice was still cold, and said he was going to hunt, and left the cave. Turnip looked at him leaving, couldn't help but let out a sigh of relief, and felt a little surprised in her heart. Just like that, she left. She couldn't help but hug herself tightly and cried sadly. She didn't know how Parker was doing now. Suddenly White Turnip, bringing a flash of light, excitedly covered his mouth. He can take advantage of the present to run away. Immediately after the action, she quickly ran out of the cave and ran towards the forest. She kept gasping for air, thinking that she must escape. "I can't fall into the hands of the stray beasts. It's better to escape back and die. I won't regret it either." At that moment, a huge snake's tail rushed out from the side and caught the single lamb in a deadly coil. He was seriously hunting, but suddenly heard something. A little puzzled him. Curtis looked a short distance away, thinking it was Turnip. Keenly aware of the footsteps, he quickly swung his snake tail and moved over. Knowing that White Turnip was trying to run, he hurriedly chased after him. White Turnip also heard the sound. Her face was ugly. She turned back. He chased after him so quickly. How can she hunt so close? This man was too sharp. Soon Curtis stretched his long snake tail and grabbed at the girl. Turnip screamed in fear, but still, she couldn't avoid him, and was caught by Curtis in a tight coil with the snake's tail. Not realizing that he had still caught it, quickly brought into his arms. Curtis gently pressed against the back of the girl's ear. Gotcha! White Turnip cried out in terror, shivering in his arms. He couldn't help but raise his head slightly, gauging his expression, seeing his face ugly and gloomy. Knowing that it was angry, Curtis couldn't help but spit out snake letters from his mouth, and he wondered suspiciously to himself how it could smell like blood. He quickly found the injury, so he lifted Turnip's leg and asked if it was hurt. Turnip didn't think he would come to this, shy face full of red, only to see Curtis stretched out his tongue letter, licking the soles of her feet. Shocked voice questioned, "What are you doing?" "You quickly stop licking it." Curtis licked her wounds and then took her in his arms. "I should have taken you with me to hunt, so that Bai wouldn't be hurt by running away." White Turnip blushed with shame and thought to herself with some incredulity, this person just looked like he was storming out, and then suddenly he was so gentle again. Suddenly Curtis carefully looked at her face, a little puzzled. "How come there are fewer black spots on your face?" White Turnip was shocked when she heard this. Her face was horrified and she thought, "This is bad. The eyeliner dots are almost gone." So looking panicked, he pushed Curtis away. "You let go of me first." Curtis' hand was still frozen in place, not knowing what was going on. But he reached out and tentatively wiped the black spots from the girl's face with his thumb, telling her to stay still. After Curtis wiped it off, he suddenly frownsy for a moment, his eyes in some kind of uncontrollable shock. Couldn't help but murmur in a low voice, this girl in front of him with white and translucent cheeks, "Bai, you're so pretty." On the following day, the light of the sun shone into the cave. When the air outside was very fresh, Curtis walloped Turnip Bai and cupped her chin. "Don't run away again. You can't escape. I don't want you to get hurt again." He looked deeply at the girl and tenderly stroked her cheek. "Be good and wait for me to come back. I'll go and catch food for you." Curtis walked a distance, then suddenly turned his head and looked at the girl behind him. His eyes were very firm. "I'll be back soon." Turnip Bai waited for him to leave, curled up her body. The tight line in her head loosened. What to do? There's no way to escape like this. The girl walked in the direction of the cave with her bare feet, describing crawling barefoot, afraid of snakes and even afraid to step on the place where the snakes swam by. At this time, White Turnip came to the outside of the cave. She Saturday on the edge of the river and put her feet in the water, but now she was trapped by a big python snake. She cried with pearly blossoms, her tears snapping and falling like she didn't want money. There was still a wet and cold feeling on her body now. Turnip Bai frowned tightly as she cried even more, secretly thinking in her heart, how can she wake up from this nightmare? The sky slowly darkened. At this time Curtis has returned to the cave. He slowly walked in, afraid of scaring the girl inside. Curtis threw the prey on the ground. The girl looked at the scene was very surprised, afraid to hide backward. White Turnip looked at the living rabbit on the ground. Her face was very panicked. "What the hell is this? It's so big, and you're asking me to eat it. I won't eat it." At this moment, Curtis grabbed the rabbit on the ground, stretched out his sharp claws, and cut the rabbit's neck. He handed the dead rabbit, dripping with blood, to Turnip, and the girl looked at the rabbit in front of her, helpless. "She wanted me to eat it raw." This scene scared Bai Turnip to the point of trembling, straight into a cold sweat, looking down at the ground. He will not always be like here and drink blood, right? Turnip frowned and stared with wide eyes. Her voice trembled as she stared at Curtis. "I don't eat it raw." Curtis heard her say this, then reached out and rubbed his chin, stood there thinking for a while. "Okay, you wait." He found some twigs and rocks and lit a fire in the cave and seriously roasted the meat. "Is this really edible? It must be awful." White Turnip said these words behind him, but he heard them, twisting his head around to look at her with a helpless face. "Then what do you like to eat?" The girl pouted, not even looking at Curtis, puffed up and said to him, "I want to eat rice." "I did not expect," Curtis promised. She slowly opened her eyes, two eyes glowing, staring at him. "Not that planting is easy to death." She looked at Curtis in the black smoke. "Parker is still angry because I want to eat rice. How can a cold-blooded wandering be so kind?" At this point, White Turnip had changed her mind about him and recognized him. Puck had also said that males planted the land to please the females. Turnip looked at Curtis, who was carefully helping her roast meat. Could it be that he was trying to please me? Curtis stretched out his hand and touched the roasted rabbit meat. Then he was burned by the meat and hastily retracted his hand. Turnip looked at Curtis, who was burnt. She couldn't help but smile. Snakes seemed to be most afraid of fire. He should never roast meat. Right. At this time, Curtis cut the meat into small slices and put it on the lotus leaf. He smiled evilly. "Shall Bai, the meat is roasted." "Eat it." The girl reached out and took a piece of meat from him. "I'll eat this is enough." Curtis was puzzled. "That's all you're going to eat?" Curtis saw that Bai turnip was full, but he walked over and took her hand. She was a little alarmed. "Since she's full, it's time to go to bed." Turnip Bai's face instantly reddened and she coughed lightly. She frowned tightly as she thought. Curtis wouldn't be trying to mate, would he? Suddenly, she reached out and blocked Curtis' movement. Turnip Bai didn't dare to look directly into his eyes. "I'm not sleepy yet. You go to sleep first." Curtis' face was a big grin, but White Turnip had already refused, so he had to stop. Getting up, he looked at Turnip. He transformed into his snake body, while White Turnip leaned against the wall. It was surprising that he was so nice and wasn't in such a hurry to mate like Puck was. At this point, Turnip was too sleepy to open his eyes and Saturday on the floor shaking. "It looks like Curtis shouldn't touch me tonight." Turnip dropped her guard and fell asleep. Curtis saw this and rushed over to catch Turnip as she was about to fall. The girl fell into Curtis' arms. Curtis looked at Turnip in his arms with deep affection. There was nothing he could do for her. By this time, it was already very late, and Turnip was already asleep, leaning on Curtis' body, sleeping very peacefully. Turnip suddenly opened her eyes, but her complexion was still a bit confused. At this time, Turnip had already felt the warmth underneath her body. When she saw the snake underneath her, she screamed in fear, and her voice pierced through the entire forest. White Turnip had a look of rawness on her face. "Why am I sleeping on a snake's body?" Curtis was very puzzled and helpless after being woken up by her. At this time, Curtis changed back to his body and asked her, "What's wrong?" But to his surprise, she said, "It's disgusting. I am most afraid of snakes." Turnip Bai lowered her head and looked a little panicked. "I actually slept on a snake last night. His tail is still wrapped around me again." Curtis looks at the frightened Turnip under the quilt. His face instantly crimps down. He let go of Turnip, who was trembling with fear, and looked at him with tears in her eyes. Curtis and Bai QingQing pulled the distance. He suddenly looked at the girl, who was still in the same place, and opened his mouth. "Today we go to the tribe to look for rice." When she heard that she was going to the tribe, she instantly became a different person. Her eyes were glowing, and she was thinking of a good plan. Her chance had come.